What is the correct pronunciation of God's name, Jehovah? There have been many opinions about what the correct pronunciation of God's name, Jehovah, is, and the general belief is that the correct pronunciation has been lost. But you might be surprised to know that this is not the case. A common argument is that the vowels in Jehovah are not really the vowels of Jehovah, but of Adonai. But how could that be when the first vowel of Jehovah is an E and not an A, as in Adonai? To me, this already seems to discredit the claim that the vowels of Jehovah were taken from Adonai. Perhaps you want to hear how Jehovah is pronounced in Hebrew today? Let's see how Google Translate does it in Hebrew.
Jehovah. Jehovah. Jehovah.
We heard it. Could this indeed be the correct pronunciation? Perhaps you already know that in ancient Hebrew writing, short vowels were not written. That's why we cannot determine from the oldest manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible how they were read aloud. But later, around the 7th to 8th century CE, the Masoretes A group of Jewish scribes in Tiberias and other centers developed a system of diacritical marks, dots and dashes, placed above or below the letters to indicate vowel sounds and nuances of pronunciation. But they also tried to hide the correct pronunciation of God's name. They knew it, but to prevent it from being pronounced, they intentionally only placed 2 of the 3 vowels of Jehovah, omitting the middle one, the O vowel. They did this to make God's name unreadable for those who had not learned the secret of the correct pronunciation of God's name. The Masoretes then instructed readers to read Adonai whenever God's name was found in the biblical text, or Elohim, sometimes to avoid Adonai Adonai. Today also, in Jewish synagogues, God's 4-letter name is never pronounced. Instead, it is always substituted with the word Adonai, which means Lord, during biblical readings and prayers. So we learned that the Masoretes, the scribes who copied the Hebrew Bible texts in the 7th and 8th centuries CE, introduced all the vowels into the biblical text to preserve the correct pronunciation of the text, but they intentionally omitted the O vowel in Jehovah, but on some rare occasions they accidentally wrote the O vowel as well. For example, this happened 7 times out of the 4,000 locations where the 4 letters of God's name appear in the ancient Hebrew Bible called the Aleppo Codex, which dates to 920 CE. Yes, that could happen. A scribe who knows how to pronounce God's name writes it 4,000 times with only 2 of the 3 vowels, but accidentally writes down all 3 vowels on some occasions. But what about the common belief that the true pronunciation of God's name was lost because no one pronounced it for a time? Is that true? Did all the Jewish rabbis really lose the true pronunciation, or did they just keep it secret? To learn more about this, I recommend listening to a Jewish scholar, Nehemiah Gordon, who also knows Hebrew well. He has lived in Israel since 1993. He moved there from Chicago and has since become deeply involved in biblical and Hebrew studies in Israel, including obtaining a master's degree from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. He has evidence that the true pronunciation was transmitted in secret among Jewish rabbis and was never really lost. Here's a summary about him provided by Perplexity, an AI research engine. Nehemiah Gordon is a scholar and researcher who advocates strongly for the pronunciation Jehovah as the true pronunciation of the Tetragrammaton, YHWH. He argues that the vowel points in the Masoretic text, traditionally thought to be vowels of Adonai inserted to hide the actual pronunciation, actually reflect the true vowels of Jehovah, and that this pronunciation has been preserved in various ancient Hebrew manuscripts. He points to evidence from manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls to support that Jehovah is linguistically consistent and historically grounded. Gordon also addresses common objections to this pronunciation, such as arguments about vowel pointing and the absence of a double vav, W, in ancient texts, explaining these within the context of Hebrew phonology and manuscript variations. In his studies, Gordon reveals that the Masoretes' vowel points do not just function as a reading substitution guide, Adonai, but indeed preserve aspects of the original pronunciation, albeit unintentionally in some cases. Certain rare occurrences in manuscripts like the Aleppo Codex show the full vowels of Jehovah, which he interprets as an accidental revelation of the true name. The traditional academic view that the pronunciation was lost or deliberately obscured is challenged by Gordon's findings of manuscript evidence and oral tradition. He elaborates on Hebrew grammar and historical linguistics to explain how the name Jehovah fits within biblical Hebrew verb forms related to divine self-existence and being, connecting it closely to Exodus 3:14, I am who I am. In sum, Nehemiah Gordon argues that the pronunciation Jehovah is credible, historically attested, and was not completely lost or merely a substitute reading, but the actual original name preserved in Jewish tradition and manuscripts to some extent. Here's an example from his video where he reads from Deuteronomy 6:4.
Jehovah Eloheinu, Jehovah Echad, ve'ahavta et Jehovah Elohecha b'chol levavecha.
Yes, evidence points to the fact that the true pronunciation of God's name was never lost, and as Google Translate pronounces it in Hebrew today, is actually the correct one. Let's listen to it once more.
Jehovah, Jehovah.
Thanks for watching, and see you next time.